Good day, everyone, and welcome to this session on the role of NGOs in the Global Refugee Compact. Sorry, things are changing around. Preparing for the Global Refugee Forum 2023. So a year and a half from now, we'll have the second Global Refugee Forum. My name is Manisha Thomas. I'm the Geneva representative of the Women's Refugee Commission, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this panel this afternoon. Well, this morning, I guess this afternoon in some areas. Let me just briefly first welcome our panelists, and then we will have a few introductory technical notes as well. To my left, we've got Ms. Gillian Triggs, who is the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection with UNHCR. Online, we've got Ms. Hafsar Tamisuddin. Sorry, Hafsar, I haven't had enough coffee yet. Tamisuddin, who is the chair of APRIN, which is the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, and she is also a member of the Interim Advisory Board of organizations led by persons of concern to UNHCR. She is joining us virtually from New Zealand, I believe, so very late in the day for you, I think. To my right, we have Mr. Chris Nash, who is the director of the European Network on Statelessness. And to my far left, we have Ms. Naya Dagger, who is the regional representative of MENA, the Middle East, North Africa, I have to find this. CSND, which is a civil society network and platforms for countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and GCC subregions. Gulf country?
Yes.
There's a lot of acronyms that I am not always good at sometimes. I apologize. We should have possibly another speaker, but he hasn't joined us yet. And if he does, then we'll have Juan, and I'll introduce him when he does join us. As Marcus said, please do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We would love to hear where you're from, who you're working with, and we would love to hear any comments and questions throughout the session using the chat or the Q&A. But with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Marcus, who's going to give us a bit of a brief technical introduction. Marcus, please.
Thank you, Manisha. This event has interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. Please select your preferred language using the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen.
L'interprétation est disponible en français. Veuillez sélectionner votre langue préférée à l'aide du bouton Interprétation en bas de votre écran.
Tiene disponible interpretación simultánea en español. Si lo desea, utilice el botón Interpretación que encontrará en la parte inferior de la pantalla para elegir su idioma favorito.
There's also closed captioning in English for this event, and thank you, Ellen, for providing the captions today. Click on the live transcript button in Zoom and then show subtitle. And if you want to be able to go back to something said earlier, click on view full transcript. If you encounter any issues with the platform, we are providing a backup live stream at the URL shown on your screen, but please use the Zoom app if you can. And please keep your chat box open for technical instructions and to discuss with the other participants. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button. And with that, I would like to hand back over to you, Manisha.
Thanks very much, Marcus. And so today's really kind of a bit of a kickoff in a way, leading up to the Global Refugee Forum in 2023. I can't believe it's time for another one. I remember the first one in 2019. That was a lot of preparation that went into it in a relatively short period of time, actually. So I guess this time there's a bit more prep time, which is great. And I know, Gillian, you're going to be talking to us about kicking off launching an NGO reference group for the GRF, which will be great to hear about. But I know that Hafsar, you were definitely there, and as well as many of you in the virtual room, as well as in this physical room, which is quite exciting to be in person again. And I know that there was a lot of effort that went into it and a lot of really good things that came out of the GRF, with lots of different pledges being made, huge amounts of support for really pushing forward the Global Refugee Compact. And I think with next year, given the staggering numbers of refugees that we have, the Refugee Forum is going to become even more central and I think critical in terms of really pushing member states for their obligations in terms of refugee protection. And I think as NGOs working in partnership with UNHCR, it'll be really key for us to see how we can best support the process so that we get pledges that are working really for refugees and other persons of concern for UNHCR. But so Gillian, maybe I can hand the floor over to you to tell us a little bit about your thoughts around the engagement of NGOs in the next GRF, and the GCR, and what we've done to date, what you think on that, but then also this NGO reference group for the GRF that you're going to be launching. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Manisha, and thank you all for joining for this this meeting. I think you've rather nicely framed it. Yes, this is a sort of kickoff moment, I think, for the role of NGOs, civil society, in supporting the Global Compact for refugees. And the purpose of this meeting, of course, is to launch the NGO reference group, and that's, I think, a very important move forward. The object is to advise on the preparation for the Global Refugee Forum. It's a huge pleasure to be here in person with some of you, certainly with the panelists, but also to have people online. Although personally, it's always nice, of course, to be meeting in person. We have learned from COVID that we can do this virtually, and that means we have a much greater participation in what we're doing, and that's critical, of course, to the role of non-governmental organisations generally. So, thank you all for being here. I'm really delighted to be able to launch this reference group. But before I do so, technically, not with a bottle of champagne or launching a ship, but nonetheless launching it, I'd like to make a few comments, if I may, about the importance of the NGO community in making this work. Maybe you don't all quite understand what my job is, but as an Assistant High Commissioner, my job is essentially protection, but part of that job is to oversee the work of the Global Refugee Forum group. And that's headed by Perveen Ali, who's with us here today. She and her team work very closely with me to ensure that the objectives of the compact are met and that we are prepared for the next forum. As you say, this is happening, for me, certainly extremely quickly. It seems I only arrived within weeks of the last forum, which, as you'll remember, was a very successful event. But now we are preparing for the next one, which is in December next year at the Palais. We have the Palais. We're really delighted to have it. It's the second week of December. We'll give you exact dates and so on as time goes by, but we are clarifying all of that at the moment. But we do know we've got the Palais, which gives it the sense of an occasion here at the centre of Geneva in the Palais. So we do welcome you and hope that we see as many of you as possible engaged. But I'd like to begin as close to the beginning as I can. And I like to do this because it's very important to me as an international lawyer. We begin, of course, with the Refugee Convention itself. That's 1951. We've just celebrated 70 years of the Refugee Convention. It's been under huge normative challenge, and I hope we have time to discuss this a little. But it is, in essence, a pure treaty between sovereign nations who have agreed to accept certain obligations. One, the right of access to territory to make a claim for asylum, and two, the non-derogable prohibition on returning anyone to persecution and danger. That you all know that. But the great leap forward, I suggest, is the Global Compact on Refugees, because firstly, it's not a legal document, but it's easy to read. It's in plain language. But what it did was to adopt a whole of universe approach to responding to the plight of refugees. And over the time that we've moved from the Refugee Convention to the Compact, we now have the High Commissioner reporting 100 million people are forcibly displaced. And that is an astonishing number that's moved from approximately 2 million at the time of the Refugee Convention itself to over 100 million and growing, literally as we speak in the context of the Ukraine war. So it's reasonable, of course, for us to assess the extent to which the Refugee Convention is standing up to the challenges and the extent to which the Compact, in its attempt to get a whole of society approach, it has been a successful exercise. And that's the challenge. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. But it's critical to acknowledge that the NGO community has been fundamental to the objectives of the Global Compact itself. And the High Commissioner, when he consulted on the development of the compact, the drafting of the compact, he said the open process must actively reflect and balance a range of views in the belief that the result should be a true compact. And that is the critical point. And right from the beginning, in drafting the text of the compact, the NGO community and civil society actors played a significant role. We had 490 written contributions, 160 from civil society, including NGOs. So the point I want to make is that they played a role right at the creative stage of this very important process of bringing countries, civil society, and other stakeholders, mayors, local governments, parliaments, scholars, and faith-based groups, bringing them together so that they could support the objectives of the compact. It's a revolution, in my view, of approach to a global issue, and one that builds on some core ideas. One is global solidarity, and linked to that is the principle of the equitable sharing of the burden and responsibilities for refugees. They're simple ideas, but ones that, of course, are by no means easy to achieve in practice. I won't use this session today to talk about what the normative challenges are, but you will all know that some countries deny the viability today of the refugee asylum system, that it's broken. We have closed borders through COVID. 168 countries at one stage closed their borders. Many, if not most of them, denying any access to asylum seekers to make a claim. And we also have very, very aggressive pushbacks and breaches of the principle of refoulement. They are very serious and have been very serious challenges, compounded by the attempts by the United Kingdom and Denmark to pick up the Australian model and, of course, the American model with the MPP program to, in a sense, and it's a big word and not always appropriate, but nonetheless to externalize asylum to other countries, and tragically to countries, poorer countries, often desperately poor countries, who need the income, to put it as bluntly as one can. So those are the challenges. But in meeting those challenges, the NGO community has been absolutely crucial. And I will come back to those points, but I wanted to just keep a chronological approach. That first of all, we had the NGO community very strongly involved in crafting the compact itself. Secondly, then, we came to the first of the forums in December 2019, which was the first effort to see the extent to which those compact ideals could be given some kind of practical effect through various initiatives, but most particularly through pledging. And I'm sure most of you in this meeting will remember that we had, if I remember correctly, 1,400 pledges, which was a brilliant start. There was a terrific atmosphere in the room. We were all in the room at that time. I think there were 3,000 people came, and the NGO community, a very strong contributor. The High Commissioner was very wise. When he summed up, he said, it has the makings of success. I thought at the time, we could do better than that. But he was right, because who knows what was going to happen after that. And within weeks of that pledging conference, we had COVID. And for 2 years, there's no doubt at all that has slowed things down. But the test of whether or not these words on a page and the pledging were going to mean anything in the real world that we're all operating in was really at the high-level officials meeting in December last year. In other words, 2 years after the forum. And we had, for the first time, and I'm astonished in a way, but the compact has got a mechanism for evidence-based determination of the extent to which this compact is working. And that was through the indicator report. And you will all remember that indicator report produced evidence, including financial evidence through the OECD DAC system, but also through our own work and your work reporting in, to see the extent to which the pledges were going to be effective, along with other mechanisms, the support mechanisms in North Central America for Afghanistan, and for the Horn of Africa, broadly speaking. They've been, I think, successful. But what we were particularly looking to, as a practical matter, was to what extent is this pledging process working? And here we see the NGOs playing an important role. 1/4 of all the pledges were submitted by NGOs. And that's pretty impressive. But that was really just the beginning. That was when we were really starting this process. But a quarter of the 400 pledges then made by the NGO community, 60% have been updated. And that's a critical part of it, because we can't prove, we haven't got evidence that the pledges are working unless you report. It's crucial, because that's the whole point of the indicator report and the whole point of stock taking, to see what we've achieved. Are these words more than aspirations? Are they real? 16% of the NGO pledges have been fulfilled, and I imagine it's progressed a bit since then. But this is really important. And one I'd like to mention is the Poverty Alleviation Coalition reports that supported 62,000 households with livelihood programs, helping them to achieve a level of self-sufficiency and self-reliance. And they're key to the work of UNHCR at the moment. And I hope we can talk about all of these things as these days go by during this really remarkable NGO meeting that we've now got in Geneva. We also have, shortly after the GRF, the International Council for Voluntary Agencies, ICFA, which is a global network of NGOs supported with analysis and understanding of the results of their engagement, and mapping the extent to which, through that network, they've been able to achieve the outcomes. And we've actually seen and reported, of course, at the high-level officials meeting last December, the increased role of other groups in society, particularly faith-based organizations, and of course, other groups. I've been really interested in the engagement of the mayors, local governments, cities. They, in fact, I don't like using the word burden of refugees, because I don't think it's the right word, but it's in the compact. But they have accepted the responsibility for refugees coming, and the burden is at the local level. So we've seen much more engagement by mayors and local government, but also parliamentarians and through faith-based groups in various ways. And they have all been involved in this stock-taking exercise to see what's the effect of COVID-19 on implementing the pledges, and how successful has it been. I was very worried, privately, I'd have to say, at least, before the high-level officials last December. Because, as I said before, this was the critical moment where we were going to have objective evidence to show whether any of this was working at all. And I was very concerned, as I'm sure you were, that we saw clear evidence of vaccination inequality. How could we talk about the Global Compact and the equitable sharing of responsibility if we can't even, in the context of a pandemic that was killing millions, how could we not demonstrate an equitable access to vaccines? I was worried that would really undermine the entire compact, that many countries, particularly from Africa, would say to us, this isn't working. It's just more language, it's more UN speak, it's more undertakings and pledges, but none of it's having any impact. But I can honestly say that by the time we got to December with the impact report, we actually had solid evidence of the extent to which pledgings were starting to work, the support platforms were working, the asylum capacity support system was starting to become more effective. We were getting a global engagement with the language of the compact, and we were getting pledges being genuinely implemented and reported on. Not to the level we would have liked, but nonetheless a high level of reporting and a high level of engagement with implementing those pledges. But beyond that, because what I had to say about the impact report, indicator report, was not going to be in itself sufficient, but what was really encouraging, and I've seen this in my nearly 3 years with UNHCR, the huge support of our member states. Even though the African states and states in Asia, parts of North Central America in particular, would speak to us about their deep concern that the principle of equitable sharing was not working very well for them, they nonetheless stuck by the principles of the compact and stood up for it in the meeting, and accepted that COVID did have a negative effect on the capacity to implement many of the pledges. And we think that's a fair estimate. But what we particularly value is their continuing support, but most particularly, of course, the continuing support of civil society and the NGO groups that have made this work in practical terms. So I did want to thank you all. There are challenges. We continue to have normative challenges against the Refugee Convention itself and against the principles of the compact. There will be naysayers, but overwhelmingly, I believe, and I see, if I can say this, over the last 15 months, I've had missions to 30 countries, and I can say the support for the compact and then growing knowledge and information about the compact is rising, and that is due, in large part, I believe, to the role of civil society and the NGOs, because you are ensuring that this message is getting out at the community level, at the local level. And what we've done since then have been a number of consultations. We've done something I don't think we've ever done in UNHCR before, but we've had almost weekly meetings with the NGO community to keep them abreast of what we're doing on particular topics. We've tried to stay as close as possible as we've been able to. Again, not perfect. It's not a perfect environment when we're doing it virtually, but we stayed in contact, and I don't think we've ever had this level of engagement that we've been able to have over the last 18 months, partly because of COVID, because we accepted that the way to work was virtually. There are challenges, and one of it is that you will know from the statistic I've already given you that with 60% of the NGO pledges receiving updates, 40% have not. And I really do urge you, please do the reporting. It gives us the evidence from an objective source about what you've achieved, and that gives strength to our arm in promoting the compact and the effectiveness of the compact. Only 21 of the pledges were from local NGOs, and those were early days when those pledges were made. But COVID has taught us, the war in Ukraine is teaching us, we must work and need to work much more closely with local community groups. In many instances, in responding to COVID, we didn't have access. We had to rely on local communities, and we are now working as hard as we can to reach the pledges of the Grand Bargain, to ensure that more funding is going to these groups. And we do ask that the bigger international NGOs work themselves to ensure that the smaller groups are properly engaged. So the number 21 is small, but we think that'll be a lot larger, and we really look forward to your support in developing it. So please think about not only your existing pledges, but what you can do to promote pledges for the next forum. And that's where, as Manisha said, that's where the work comes in. It's a lot of work. We know it's a lot of work. In every individual pledge takes work. And if you're dealing with maybe thousands of pledges, every one of them takes a great deal of effort, and we all have to work together to achieve it. So with that, I would like to officially launch the NGO reference group for the Global Refugee Forum. That's the objective. And I'd like to read out, if I may, the 14 NGO networks that cover different regions, global issues, and refugee-led organizations. And I'll read them out because you may not all know who they are. But firstly, of course, ICFA, Interaction, the Refugee Council USA, CEJIL, Sigil, I'm not familiar with them, but we'll get familiar. Riadis, Red Clamor, Salam South Africa, the Consortium for Refugees and Migrants in Southern Africa, REDDS, APPRN, the MENA Civil Society Network for Displacement, ECRA, the European Council for Refugees and Exiles. Sorry? Exiles. Yes, not a word I would have used. Anyway, we won't debate that one. The European Network on Statelessness, and the UNHCR's Permanent Advisory Board for organizations led by, and I'm not even going to say it because we don't use those words anymore, led by people who've been forcibly displaced. We don't use the word persons of concern anymore. Oh, it's a terrible phrase. We get that message from you, and I've certainly said this is completely unacceptable language. And now from the top, from the High Commissioner, we are not using this language. We've got the message, and I don't even like the word persons. I much prefer to talk about people. But anyway, all reasonable minds will differ about language. But anyway, we are trying to clean this up. So the group is going to be important. It will, if you've had a look at the terms of reference, it's to advise on the preparations for the Global Forum. to facilitate the development of pledges and initiatives. And that will be a critical role, but keeping our feet to the fire, making sure that we're reporting accurately. We've got the evidence we need to show by next December that the compact has real meaning, real engagement with the NGO community, but real outcomes. And that is really what we need to focus on. What are the outcomes? What are we actually achieving in a world where there are so many challenges? So I really thank you all for being part of this reference group. I do hope that we can get a higher level of reporting, that we can think about new pledges and really support the process, because I really believe in the compact. I think it's the way forward in these very, very troubling times where the challenges probably are greater than the UN refugee community has ever seen. I think we need to show that this compact is not only aspirational, but is capable of delivering real outcomes for the people that we all want to protect in our various ways. So thank you all, and I hope I haven't spoken for too long, and over we go.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And I think it's great that this NGO reference group is going to be there to really hold, as you said, your feet to the fire, but I think it'll be a critical role as well in terms of really gathering the NGO community and really pushing us to provide more pledges, to do more joint pledges potentially as well. And I think Praveen and I were talking about it, having some sort of a way that we can do joint pledges even with states or, mayors or whatnot, so that we've got that sort of collective approach to really implementing the GCR will be critical. I'm still looking for the dating app so that we can match pledges, a bit of a match pledging dating app sort of thing. So that would be great, I think, if we can find those ways, because I think, as you said, as the High Commissioner said, the first one had the makings of what can be a success. And I think building on what came out of that first year and really applying some of those lessons so that we can have some more concrete joint pledges, I think will be great. And I look forward to all these networks. I wasn't joking when I said there were a lot of acronyms, right?
Yeah, that's right. You're right.
We'll come to understand all those acronyms later on. But yes, indeed, some of them, like ICFA, even the voluntary and ICFA, different age when they were created back in the 60s and whatnot. Language, as you said, does change and evolve over time. So with that, we've got that kind of kickoff, but I'm going to turn to our panelists now for a little bit of reflection, sort of what's happened since the GRF, and then have a bit of a conversation also, what you're all going to be doing kind of as part of the NGO reference group, but also in the lead up to the GRF. So Chris, I'm going to turn to you first. Chris is the director and co-founder of the European Network on Statelessness and one of the members of the NGO reference group. Chris has been working in refugee and migration issues for over 22 years, initially an asylum lawyer, and he used to work at ECRI. That's why he knew the acronym so well. And now is with the Network on Stateless, the European Network on Statelessness. And at the GRF in 2019, the ENS, or the European Network on Statelessness, advocated with EU institutions for the adaptation of holistic regional strategies to address statelessness and expand and further develop a statelessness index to monitor and research progress in European law and policy and practice. So Chris, how have you managed to mobilize such coherent action, and what's the role of the European Network on Statelessness been since the GRF?
Thanks, Manisha, and it's kind of you to describe it as concerted action, and I think that's in part due to the breadth and diversity of our membership, which includes over 170 members in 41 European countries. And that ranges from large international NGOs to small grassroots organizations. And I would particularly want to acknowledge the critical contribution of stateless people and community-led organizations within our network to help achieving impact. And I think it goes back to the point that Gillian made about the importance of localized action. The breadth of our network also helps us to achieve a multiplier effect, as well as act as an interlocutor towards in advocating for holistic regional strategies to address statelessness before institutions such as the European Union and the Council of Europe. And we have had some success over the last couple of years, for example, in encouraging amendments which address the particular protection needs of stateless people to be integrated in the EU Asylum and Migration Pact. We've also helped encourage the inclusion of priorities to address statelessness in the European Commission's Child Rights Strategy and Roma Strategy. Similarly, in parallel, at the Council of Europe level, the Council of Europe made several pledges at the last GRF, and one of those was to hold a major conference on statelessness, which was co-organized with UNHCR, and Gillian spoke at that in September last year, and that has been a really important platform from which the member states of the Council of Europe have made commitments to address childhood statelessness in particular, and we and our members were very happy to help support that initiative both prior to and at the conference. Turning now to the second pledge we made, Manisha, which you asked about, which was to expand and develop our statelessness index, which is the first online tool which enables an instant comparison of how different European countries are performing with regard to their law, policy and practice on statelessness. So we assess the performance of states against international law, norms and good practice, and we update the index on an annual basis, scoring and assessing states. Since 2019, we've expanded the index to now cover 30 countries, and it really is becoming a critical tool in enabling us to underpin our advocacy and inform our advocacy to identify where the gaps in law and policy are, where they need to be filled, and therefore to act as a critical benchmarking tool so that we can hold governments to account in respect of their obligation towards stateless people, or to use Gillian's term, which I really like, to help hold their feet to the fire on that. And in terms of maybe just in summing up or a few final reflections, I was asked to say a little bit about our role in the GRF process itself. And for us, that was from the get-go, that was very much a priority, not only because statelessness is obviously a key part of UNHCR's mandate, but as we know, statelessness is both a cause and a consequence of forced displacement, as was recognized in the New York Declaration. And perhaps most importantly, in concrete terms, the fact that the over 300 pledges made at the high-level segment on statelessness, organized by UNHCR as part of its I Belong campaign in October 2019, just ahead of the GRF, those 300 places, 300 pledges have been incorporated as part of the GRF pledging and monitoring process. So both ENS and our sister statelessness networks in other regions have been working hard to try and leverage those pledges and to encourage their implementation and to encourage states to make new pledges. And I would have to say that our ability to do this has been very much assisted by the inclusive way in which UNHCR have organized the GRF consultations, in the run-up to the high-level officials meeting in 2019, including, for example, a dedicated stock-taking event on statelessness. But I think that inclusive approach to involving civil society has been incredibly helpful, and to pay testament to the work of Parveen and her team. And also, a final word, just to acknowledge the very welcome leadership role that Gillian has played in championing the importance of addressing statelessness as part of UNHCR's mandate, including in the context of GRF. And that really does make a big difference. So thank you to Gillian, and I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Chris. And I have lots of questions for you around the index, but I'll come back to those later once we've got a chance to hear from all our panelists. But great to see the work that the network and the members are doing, and that you've got that statelessness index as sort of a way to really map progress and see where the gaps are, so that you can really continue that work on really fighting statelessness. So that's great. Hafsar, we were working together on a panel for the GRF back in 2019 on age, gender, and diversity, not just an acronym. And it's great to have you again, or to be on a panel with you. So Hafsar, thank you for joining us from quite a distance away. Hafsar is the chair of APRIN, the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, pardon me. And she's also a member of the Interim Advisory Board of organizations led by persons who are forcibly displaced. Is that now the new name?
I'd prefer to say people who have been forcibly displaced.
Led by, there we go. Maybe I have to change the name.
But that's just me. That doesn't have the imprimatur of the whole organization.
I would second that, because every time someone says POC, I think protection of civilians, or point of contact, not person of concern.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I like people who have been forcibly displaced. Anyway, Hafsar is on this interim advisory board. Hafsar is a former Rohingya refugee from Myanmar. She's been involved in all sorts of different advocacy and activism spaces on statelessness, refugee rights, asylum seekers, detention of migrants and refugees, and prevention of sexual and gender-based violence for over a decade. She's worked with refugee communities on the prevention of GBV and child marriage in Malaysia for 8 years now. And she's a community development navigator and social worker at Changemakers Resettlement Forum in New Zealand. And she's also, as I mentioned, the chair of APRIN, but she's also a steering committee member of the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, or ACNOR, and New Zealand's country coordinator of Free Rohingya Coalition, and on the advisory panel now. So Hafsar, you were there at the 2019 GRF, and I'm sure going to be scaling up for the 2023 one. APRIN at the time had arranged a session on partnerships in supporting national protection capacity and the provision of legal aid services to asylum seekers and refugees, which discussed, for example, the PillNet pledge to provide pro bono legal assistance to refugees. Do you want to give us a bit of an update on what's been happening since then to advance this agenda around legal assistance? And are there any other aspects of the GRF that APRIN would want to highlight, or you and your role on the advisory board?
Thank you. First, to your question, yes, there are updates on the legal community pledge. There is a new project matching process going on right now to match projects from NGOs and RLIs with law firms that will continue through August. There is also a move by the core group of the pledge to look at and strengthen the governance of the pledge and how to make it more relevant for RLIs. A part of the matching has been helping and supporting RLIs to register as legal organizations in their countries of operations. Through the effort that we continue to make to support RLIs, we have identified that it is very important to be mindful of the diverse need of RLIs based on the countries where they are operating, and also the barriers of RLIs to the accessibility of resources to enable their initiative or the sustainability of their initiative. We need to explore ways to bridge those barriers to ensure that RLIs and RLOs are meaningfully supported and empowered and can participate. And we need to do so through genuine and transparent consultation with RLIs and people with lived experience. It is even more crucial to ensure that RLIs feel welcome and heard as our equal partners in responding to refugees and forced displaced issues in the region. Secondly, as a former refugee and someone with lived experience, I would like to draw your attention, all of you here, to continue to monitor on the progress of implementation and mobilization of the Meaningful Participation Pledge as we move along with this preparation. It was very delightful to see that 70 plus refugee representatives were invited to participate in GRF 2019, which I am one of them. We hope that the theme of GRF 2023 will ensure the diverse and inclusive representation of refugees and people with lived experience without leaving anyone behind. Again, to ensure equitable access to the participation of GRF 2023, it is important for us to identify and bridge all the barriers of the affected populations to be able to participate and create opportunities for them to be able to represent, contribute, and participate in any possible way that they can. Finally, as a partner organization, I can look forward to work along with UNHCR to ensure the diverse and inclusive participation and representation of refugees in GRF 2023. And we look forward to continuing to engage in preparation for GRF with UNHCR and other partner organizations in any possible way that we can. Thank you, Manish.
Thank you very much, Hafsar. And I think it's great that those legal pledges and the support is continuing. And I think that point really about making sure we've got representative voices from refugees and persons with lived experience at the GRF next year will be equally important as it was in 2019. So really building on some of those lessons of how it works, especially in terms of getting visas. I remember that was a big challenge. Now you've got lots of time to start that process, which always takes quite a bit of effort, but it will be great and hopefully get to see you at the next GRF again, Hafsar. I'm going to turn next to Naya, sorry. Naya Dagger is the joy of being non-paper is that I've now gone and lost her bio. I apologize, 1 second. I've got too many windows open, just give me a second. So Naya is the representative of MENA CSND, which is a civil society network and platform for countries in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf country subregions. What's the second C for?
GCC, global. Now I have too many acronyms in my mind, and everything's jumbled up together. It's global. Gulf completely, yeah.
Gulf country councils.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. And it includes members from faith-based organizations, NGOs, artistic and cultural foundations, media outlets, human rights institutions, academic actors and institutions, private sector organizations, and sports organizations, amongst others. So it's quite a broad network that you're representing there. Naya is the Secretariat Coordinator of the Lebanon Policy Research Network on Displacement and a project coordinator at Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. And she's worked on topics related to refugee law, disability rights, religion, development, and music. And Naya is also on the advisory. You're on the. No, you're not on the advisory board. Sorry, that was you. Sorry, I apologize. So Naya, just give me a second. I'm scrolling through my screens one more time. So can you tell us why it's important with CSND? Yeah. No, hang on a second. Yeah, how is it important? Why is it important that you're working with refugee-led organizations? And how are you planning to include refugees in different events, but also improve their voice at a local level as equal partners?
Well, seeing as we are part of the Middle East and North Africa and GCC countries, I think with the Syrian refugee crisis now, it has one of the most numerous number of refugees that are fleeing from Syria towards countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, and even to Europe, namely to countries such as Germany and France and Turkey. For us, refugee-led organizations are extremely important because sometimes governments in our areas are not that receptive to refugees coming to their land, quote unquote, especially since most countries in the region, such as Lebanon, is not very economically stable at the moment or politically stable. So for the government to have an extra role in helping refugees is a bit difficult. Mm-hmm. So for refugees to be able to have their own voice and to be able to advance what they need in such countries is extremely important. And what we have done in the region is sort of try to work on social tensions and social cohesion present inside communities, which was extremely important given religious tensions, given political tensions, economic tensions, and the list goes on, especially after the COVID pandemic and the Beirut blast in Lebanon that just exacerbated everything. So what we have done is we have established a MENA academic journal and digital platform, which provides Arabic research and publication related to displacement. And it's led by the Arab Institute for Human Rights in Tunisia. And the American University of Beirut has also published 3 editions of the 101 Facts and Figures on the Syrian refugee crisis. And what it aims to do is to counter false information on Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and it's based on evidence-based research. Because as we know in the region, especially with the delicate relationship between Lebanon and Syria, considering the 1975 civil war, it's a very touchy subject. So we just want to make sure that organizations led by refugees don't fall in that trap of being pushed to the side and being part of this whole social tension. In relation to NGOs and foundations, they helped a lot of governments and local authorities in times of crisis, such as COVID-19 and such as the Beirut blast, and they adapted their programs and their pledges to ensure the continuity of the work of refugees in the region and the work of refugee-led organizations as well. And something that Ms. Gillian was talking about, which was faith-based organizations. Now they have a very important role in the region, and what they're doing is they're facilitating social cohesion, and they're bringing light to social tensions. we have received more than $23.6 million in refugee zakat funds that helped over 687,000 refugees and ITPs in 14 countries in the MENA region. And what we've also done is expanded space for constructive dialogue through art and culture. And we've established, or we've made a collaborative video on resilience and solidarity. And it was published on the International Day of Peace on 21 September 2021. And it featured prominent cultural figures and refugee artists from 14 countries in the MENA. So we're trying to give the refugees a bigger voice and a wider space to voice their concerns.
Great. Thanks so much, Naya. And I think that's great that you're doing that. And I think a really good example of what could be potentially brought even to the GRF next year. And there was actually a question in the Q&A from Parsu Sharma, Luto UNHCR, actually. Thanks for this wonderful launch. As a refugee-led organization with people from lived experience, how can the voice of grassroots refugees be part of the GRF in 2023? As there are many unsung heroes from refugee communities who are not in the lens of UNHCR and who can contribute to the GRF more meaningfully. So maybe that's something that we can also reflect on as we start to talk about the NGO reference group as well. Maybe Naya, I'll come back to you maybe just to follow up on that one, but I know that Hafsar, I was supposed to have asked you the question around the interim advisory board. I apologize. My run of show had an XXX, so I thought it was for you, Naya.
No, that's okay.
No problem.
So
it is now the permanent advisory board.
Oh, it's the permanent one now.
It is now. Yes.
It's not an interim, sorry.
Yes, it is now. And yeah, that's okay.
Even though the title will change to persons forcibly displaced.
That's right.
But in terms of your involvement in that group, Hafsar, it was recently established, so it's very timely, also considering the localization topic for this year's NGO consultations. What can you tell us about sort of the work of the advisory board and why it's important to include refugee voices there? And then maybe you can also reflect on how do you make sure that those unsung voices or the refugee voices that you don't normally hear about are also included in the work of the advisory board?
Thank you. Just to quickly reflect on is that the evidence that we have seen about the positive impact that we can make by having the people with lived experience in this space, allowing them to participate and contribute meaningfully. So in responding the issues of refugees and forced displacement in the past, we didn't have so much of participation from the people with lived experience. Now we acknowledge and learn the fact that we need to apply a whole of society approach and a localization approach in responding this, which cannot be meaningful without having people with lived experience at the center. And I believe the meaningful participation of refugees is not a privilege. It is our right to be in this space, and simply because it is about us. Eventually, when we started to include refugees and people with lived experience in this space, then we then end up reflecting to the question that this person raised, nominating the ones who we know or who have more privileges among the refugees themselves and among the people with lived experience. And oftentimes, the least represented and the most marginalized groups remain invisible and excluded. And we need to find a way to include them. Because of that exclusivity and participation and engagement of refugees from diverse backgrounds remain to be a huge barrier to the meaningful participation of refugees from different contexts and diverse backgrounds again. So it is very important for this advisory panel of UNHCR to advise and inform the inclusive approach, which will ensure the meaningful participation of refugees and people with experience at all levels of intervention, decision-making, and engagement. Again, if I may reemphasize again, without leaving anyone behind. And if I may also honestly and frankly comment on this, we still need to ensure the grassroots and inclusive representation in this space. For instance, we may have refugees not only being refugees, they have been stateless people in their entire life who may not necessarily have the same privileges as others to have education or literacy. We have to look at all the barriers for different people still to be meaningfully engaged and still to be contribute in this space. We need to implement the model of leaving no one behind in practice. It also needs to start, if I may again honestly comment on to this, from refugee-led organization and from ourselves to start to be inclusive. When we claim ourselves to be international and global refugee representative groups or organization, as we call, we need to reflect how inclusive and diverse we are. And it is our responsibility to explore ways to be as inclusive as possible. Because the meaningful participation will not be achieved without being inclusive. And of course, we expect this from our allies and partners such as NGOs and INGOs and state as well. And it is very possible if we look beyond and think outside of the box and really understand the barriers and bridge those barriers in consultation with the people affected by displacement. And we very much look forward to the systemic change that will ensure the inclusion and participation of all refugees and affected population. And I believe this permanent advisory panel have a very important role to ensure this happen and to continuously inform and guide UNHCR and other NGOs to make this happen. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hafsar. And I think that point really about it, we really all need to be working to really ensure that we're being inclusive and not, as you said, only looking at the voices that have more privilege or have more access, and really finding ways to ensure that the voices of those the voices that you may not hear so much, so those who are marginalized, we find ways to bring them in as well. I guess linking that to sort of the role of the NGO reference group, kind of moving ahead towards the Global Refugee Forum in 2023. You know, Gillian, you talked about how it's going to have these 14 NGO networks in there. In terms of kind of moving ahead and preparing for the GRF in 2023, and I'm asking this to all of the panelists and you as well, Gillian, are there any specific pledges or any joint NGO pledges that you'd like to work towards, and how do you maybe envision using the NGO reference group to achieve those? Don't know who wants to start. There's also a question, actually, maybe I could bring this one in, about how accessible is the reference group with the aim of contributing to its work in preparation for the next forum. That's from Mywin, who's Refugees Advocate. I can't see the full name, I apologize. It's in the Q&A. I'm not sure, Mywin, if you wanted to clarify what you meant, the Refugees Advocacy Network, sorry. In terms of accessibility, is that in terms of bringing others on board, or what were you thinking about the accessibility function there? Mywin, either you can take the floor and clarify that for us as we hear some thoughts, or we can, if you want to type that into the Q&A as well, that might be helpful as well, just to clarify that question for us, please. But yeah, in terms of some pledges or joint pledges that any of you would like to work on or see moving ahead.
Well, perhaps if I could just kick it off. I think the idea of the reference group with the 14 groups that I've read out to you, the idea is that you would find access through those groups. And if that wasn't working, well, we need to know about it. You know, if you tried to or applied to become part of a group and found it didn't work for any number of reasons, let us know, because that is the point of having these groups. But with regard to the wider question, I might pass to Paveen, because she's and her team have been following the precise pledges to see whether there are ones that can be strengthened and augmented for the purposes of the forum next year. So if you don't mind me putting Paveen on the spot.
Paveen, you're okay with that?
I'm happy to contribute. Maybe just on the question of the process for the group, what we're hoping to, one of the reasons why we wanted to have this group be comprised of representatives of different networks from all the regions and also global networks was to ensure that we could have the broadest reach possible. And so the role of the members of this group really will be to ensure that there is regular communication between, with the process, between all the members of their networks and the process of the development and preparations for the forum. So what we aim to do over the course of the next 18 months is to work with this group at every phase of the preparations process to discuss ideas, to co-shape how the pledging process should look, how the mobilization of different stakeholders should look, how we can better facilitate pledge matching. and to really hear from the different members of the network consolidated ideas, feedback, and suggestions from their networks in the context of this reference group to help us co-shape the process as we move ahead. So this is really the main, what we see is the kind of the formal entry point for engaging in the GRF process. But of course, there are many informal ways of doing so too. And I think a lot of the work will be done in the regions. We're working now with our country offices and our regional bureau on developing the platforms and the fora where we can facilitate multi-stakeholder mobilization around pledges and multi-stakeholder engagement in the lead up to the GRF. So those will also be entry points for different NGOs to engage and be a part of it. So I think we can continue to develop this as we move ahead. If you see other ways that we could structure ourselves to also facilitate regular communication as we move ahead, we'd be most welcome to hear those suggestions as well and to see what we can do and accomplish together. I think on the question of specific pledges, I might leave it to some of the panelists if there are specific pledges that you're thinking about working on. Or that you think that jointly it could be advantageous to bring several members of the group together to really to craft to build momentum and build a community around particular commitments. But maybe it would be useful, I would suggest that it would be useful to go back to the outcome document of the high-level officials meeting, because there in that document, we consolidated the feedback from the stock taking that happened over the course of the entire year last year on all the pledges and progress towards the GCR. And we've consolidated those into 20 kind of high-level recommendations for the GRF for 2023, as well as a number of follow-up actions. And I think that really, because those have been identified as the key areas where we need to progress, I think that is really our roadmap for pledge development for the GRF. And that those are the areas where we can look at perhaps how NGOs can be engaged and supporting the development of pledges in those areas. Ideally, as Manisha was saying, jointly with governments and other partners. So one of the things, maybe just to finish, that we'll be focused on with this reference group is sharing some of our initial thinking around a pledge matching mechanism and how to have more stakeholders engaged in supporting host governments and host countries that have made important commitments around protection and inclusion, and how we can bring more stakeholders to the table to really support the implementation of those important policy pledges. And so we'll be discussing with the reference group ways that we can do that more effectively over the coming months.
Super, thanks very much, Praveen. Chris, I know you wanted to take the floor, and then maybe Naya and Hafsar, I can come to you as well. That's good.
Thanks, Manisha. And maybe, just to build on some of the points made by Parveen around accessibility, because I think, the reference group is clearly going to have an important role, but equally it's important that it doesn't become a bottleneck. So all those other entry points for an inclusivity to engage others in the GRF process more broadly are really important. And I think here it's also important to acknowledge that things continue to be facilitated in a hybrid fashion, like the meeting today. But I think that obviously meeting in person is lovely, beyond lovely after having looked at our Zoom screens for 2 years. But we equally need to recognise that one of the barriers to participation is the ability to travel, and the online format does, as well as being more environmentally friendly, does also facilitate accessibility. So the more we can build the technology to do that better and better, the better. In terms of the other point to make is, I guess, in terms of at least how I perceive ENS's membership on the reference group is very much to act as a channel for other sister regional networks working on statelessness, also the emerging global movement on statelessness, to try and channel things through the reference group into the design of the next Global Refugee Forum and beyond that as well. And in this regard, I mean, it's perhaps obvious that we would seek to integrate mainstream statelessness in that process. I mean, we have seen really welcome increased prioritization by UNHCR as part of its mandate over the last decade, but there is still a tendency for it to be forgotten among other important pressing issues. And sometimes what's missed is its obvious nexus between statelessness and issues such as forced displacement, anti-discrimination, child rights, development. So yeah, we will be banging that drum on behalf of sort of civil society working on statelessness. But in terms of pledges, which is the other part of the question, Manisha, I think one important thing is to look at how the landscape has changed. So in the context of Europe, the war in Ukraine has obviously changed the landscape fundamentally. And there's clearly a gap and a need for pledges to respond to that crisis and future crises, including as these impact on stateless people. Ukraine has one of the largest stateless populations in Europe, and stateless people forcibly displaced from Ukraine can often experience barriers leaving the country or in accessing protection in other countries. There's also a risk of childhood statelessness being created, and hopefully when the conflict is over, there could be lots of barriers for return for people who are stateless and undocumented. So for us, I see a really key area for more pledges by states on this, and to see this as a bit of a lens to look at a more collective failure by European member states to identify and protect stateless people in a migratory context, despite the fact that almost all European countries have ratified the 1954 Statelessness Convention. Only a relative handful have in place dedicated stateless determination procedures. Similarly, more than half of European states do not have full safeguards in their nationality laws to grant nationality to children born on the territory would otherwise be stateless. So these are obvious things that pledges can fix. And in terms of match pledging, I guess a slight variant on that to me is the importance of regional institutions pledging, because also that can be quite efficient in terms of one regional entity pledging on behalf of a bigger bloc. And I think the Council of Europe did that quite effectively at the last GRF, but if I dare say, the EU less so. The EU was more shy in terms of the pledges it made, certainly in the domain of statelessness. So there's perhaps work to be done there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Chris. And I think maybe that opportunity that is presenting itself with the war in Ukraine and the EU mobilizing is that maybe that's a real push for the EU itself to do a pledge for next year. And I think seeing the overwhelming response to Ukraine, it is such a stark contrast to what we see in many other refugee contexts. And I think using that opportunity of that mobilization for really responding to refugees is something that we need to build on so that we have a similar response to all refugee situations, not just one that's on Europe's borders. We do have some questions in the Q&A, so thank you for those. And I'm just going to throw a couple out so that maybe you can also respond, Naya or Hafsar or Gillian, if you like, as we're moving along. But I think there's some definite questions around how the NGO reference group is going to be functioning in practice. So Gillian, you mentioned there's terms of reference. Are those available online so others can see them? And what is the group supposed to be, if they're not online, will they be shared soon? Frida is asking. And what is the group supposed to be doing in practice? And I think that point about it not being a barrier, I think, is really important. So really making sure that we as NGOs in the community hold your feet to the fire to really be sure that you're inclusive in terms of how that NGO reference group is working, I think is important. And we've got a question from Damaris, who's working with the Kenya Human Rights Commission and is working on advocating for change in refugee policies in Kenya. How do we join the reference group? And I think the reference group has been set. So it's really identifying which of those networks, Damaris, that the Kenya Human Rights Commission could be engaging through in order to really find out how to get access to that reference group via that. And I'm sure that if there's not a clear link, that Praveen and her team will be able to find a link to help you access the reference group so that you can be engaged in that. Also, we've got a question from Enzo, thanking everyone for the overview of the GRF and GCR process. And one thing to ensure the realization of the GCR and GRF is to work on collective outcomes at the country level. Does UNHCR have plans to help ensure inclusive pledge-making processes at the country level? And I guess maybe how could the NGO reference group also play a role in that could be a question. Hafsar or Naya, I don't know which one of you would like to go next in terms of any thoughts around joint pledges with JRF. You want to go, Naya?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So as for MENA CSND, what we were hoping for, first of all, in terms of our membership, is to build on the already promising engagement that we have been having on a country level, and to strengthen that by strengthening our network on the regional level by establishing a regional body. to be able, because the MENA region is such a wide region, and we need to have a specific mechanism to be able to keep up with what's going on with what was happening in Yemen and what's happening in Sudan and Palestine and in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. So we need to have a clear established body to deal with that. And we were hoping to increase the existing numbers and existing networks by focusing on countries that do have conflict and instability. Now, in regards to the pledges, what we were hoping for is to look into responsibility sharing between governments and civil society actors on 3 levels: national, regional, and global levels, especially seeing what happened yesterday with Turkey sending back refugees to Lebanon in trucks because they were not able to keep them within their borders for periods of time. And if we did have something related to responsibility sharing, then perhaps we could figure out a way to deal with issues such as this. So, yes.
Super. Thanks very much, Naya. And I think, yeah, as states, or as Jillian said, there's constantly challenges by states to the Refugee Convention, the non-derogable right of non-refoulement, and yet it's consistently happening. So how do we really kind of work with countries to make some of those pledges happen so that they don't forcibly return people? That's probably the $1 million question. On that note, Hafsar, do you have any thoughts about joint pledges and sort of what the role of the reference group could be in the lead up to the GRF?
I will just re-emphasize again the meaningful participation pledge, and I think as APRIN we will be very interested to to implement and contribute to the meaningful participation pledge of refugees, and as we continue to implement the legal community pledge, and our focus has been lately so much of the meaningful participation of refugees from diverse backgrounds and empowering our allies and RLOs in Asia-Pacific region, and to continue to do the work that we do, which is protection and promoting the rights of refugees in Asia-Pacific region more impactful way. And with that, and I think we are also open to the opportunities to contribute to other pledges that is relevant to our principles and goals of APRIN. And for me personally, the main and the most important thing that I will be very interested, whether I'm speaking wearing the head of APRIN or forcibly displaced population, it will be ensuring the meaningful participation and representation of people from diverse background without leaving anyone behind, to ensure that in every possible way that we can, and they are well represented in the space where we work for them and with them.
Thanks very much, Hafsar. And I've got Jerome. Yes, I've got you. I just wanted to say thank you to Freddie, from Reds, who has offered to help out Damaris in terms of the Kenya Human Rights Commission being engaged through the NGO reference group. So thank you for that, Freddie. And there's also a suggestion from John Slocum from Refugee Council USA, saying, given the hybrid format and in order to accommodate participants arrayed in time zones ranging from the Asia Pacific to the Americas, may I suggest that the NGO reference group consider holding some of its meetings. Now it just disappeared as I was reading it.
Time zones.
Yeah, there it goes. May I suggest in a dual format, one iteration in the morning Geneva time and a second in the evening. Sorry, someone was quicker than I was in terms of reading it and answering it. Jerome from ICFA, you have a thought about the NGO reference group and pledges, I'm guessing.
Yeah, a bit more than a thought, but try to be brief. Just wanted to maybe come back on the question of TORs and maybe explain what I think, what is our engagement as ICFA and what we think the reference group is about, and then maybe try to answer a few questions, especially the one on which John pledge we should prioritize. So for us at ICFA, what we understood in the discussions with Pervin is that the original idea of this group is to maximize UNHCR's reach and inclusiveness in its engagement with NGOs on the road to the Global Refugee Forum. So the idea is that in this group, you have NGO networks that will be counted down on to disseminate to their members, to their partners, information, about the process, opportunities to feed into the development of the process, influence also, and make propositions. So it's about understanding what are the entry points, what are the practical modalities such as registration at one point, and making sure that reaches as many of those that should be involved, and through this kind of pyramidal process. And as well, the other way around, bring back to UNHCR and to the collective wisdom, I would say, suggestions from NGOs. And on that specific point, since I was there in 2019, I think there's a lot that we can do without reinventing the wheel or starting from scratch. There's a lot that in 2019 was done by NGOs in terms of suggesting modalities for pledging, what kind of priority themes should be looked at, how to organize the GRF itself. All of that we can draw on, and also the experience that we have to bring propositions. And that's how, at least at IGVA, we will count on our members to bring some ideas, and we will develop activities that will feed into the reference group. That leads me to your question about the which John pledge. I would say for me it's a bit premature. It's important to start early on that, but I think we also should at the beginning look at exactly what I just mentioned. What do we want as modalities? What will change from 2019? What kind of priority themes? Do we keep the same? Do we keep some of the same? Do we add some? I think NGOs have suggestions on that. Should we not have something on health? Should we not, at least at IGVA, we think we should at least maintain in a way protection and solutions. Maybe something specific on statelessness rather than this add-on from the high-level segment. IDPs, there's a number of elements. Then on the pledging and the matching system, how to develop that. But if I was to answer your question, I would come back to the one big challenge, Gillian, that you highlighted, I think, 2 or 3 times, externalization. If there could be, and I'm not saying that I have the silver bullet and what this pledge would look like, but a joint pledge, a common pledge, relating to addressing externalization is in some form. I think that would be important, because it struck me that this is the big challenge that you highlighted. And even at the high-level officials meeting in December, there were a few questions about how can we make the connection with the externalization. I think there was an NGO side event at one point around that. And yeah, I think that's what comes to my mind. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jerome. And I think the point around how the NGO reference group is going to work, we're going to have the TORs are going to be, the TORs have been dropped into the chat by Leah. Thank you, Leah.
Okay, one point, sorry. We have some of our members that are also interested in knowing how the reference group would work on monitoring. And it will be important because this monitoring of pledges, sorry.
Okay.
And it's monitoring the performance and the implementation of the compact. Also important point, because the second GRF will be about new pledges, but will be also about looking at the first GRF and the pledges that were made at this first time in 2019. So just to bring that to the fore.
Is that in your TOR?
I think it could fit. I mean, I don't think the TORs are looking at specific aspects. It's looking at how the reference group can help and be propositional about the process and what should be discussed at the GRF and what kind of pledges should be made. So I think it would fit into that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jerome. And yes, thank you, Leah, for sharing those TORs. So anybody who is interested in the reference group's terms of reference, you can now just click on the link in the chat there. I wanted to kind of come back and sort of see, in this, I think the concern that had been raised by Mauen before, I had seen sort of a clarification, and then it disappeared out of the chat somehow. But he had said it was really about how do we make sure that refugee-led organizations are able to access the NGO reference group. And I'm not familiar with all of the networks in the reference group, but is there enough space there for refugee-led organizations to be accessing the NGO reference group via the networks? And also this question that Enzo had around are there any plans around having an inclusive pledge-making process at the country level? Don't know.
Yes, sure. For MENA CSND, we are working on creating a space for refugee-led organizations to be part of our network. And we do have a few refugee-led organizations that are in the top organizations in the Middle East and North Africa region. And we're working on strengthening their ability to be part of this network and to be part of the GRF in the future.
Super.
Just add something.
Yes, please, Julian.
Thank you very much, Naya. That's exactly what we think needs to be done. Of course, we do want, I think the point's been well made. It's inclusion of those least likely to have the mechanisms to speak up, and yet they're the ones with the experience and the knowledge and most to gain and lose. But their experience is important. But there are technical problems of, for example, funneling money to a refugee-led organization if it's not registered. And some countries will not, it's illegal for UNHCR to work in that way, supporting an organization that's not registered. So one of the things that we're talking about this morning was to try to see if we can find ways of strengthening the refugee-led organization so that it's better able to meet a registration process. So that will be one way of drawing them into the situation. There are others where there are simply political blockages within the country itself, and there's very little we can do other than advocacy. And I would think one of the key roles of the 14 that are on the reference group will be to pick up these issues and work in developing their advocacy with their governments, where they effectively block for political reasons the access by a refugee-led group. We also have to be, we have to be careful. We're audited like everybody else. We can't give $500,000 to a group that's not registered. There are some technical, I don't want to, because they're the last thing, we don't want to have blockages, but at the same time, we have to recognize there are some that are difficult to deal with. But that's where advocacy becomes so important, and why we have to work at the local level. And I think the point has been made very well, that we have to drill right down to the local communities to find out where this lived experience is and to draw them in. And so I think we see the role of the big international NGOs and ICVA and others who understand the context, to use their influence and advocacy to get right down to the levels where we can draw in people and meet the principle that no one should be left behind. So that's a challenge, and it's a bit of a contrast really from where we were 2 years ago to where we want to be by December at the end of next year. But it's doable. But I think the advocacy that acknowledges that it's a problem, that people are left out, and I think Chris has made the point about people who are stateless or at risk of stateless. They can be ones that find it the hardest to be registered anywhere because they haven't got they don't have bank accounts, they don't have social security numbers, maybe they don't always have stable addresses. I mean, there are all sorts of problems. And they're the one, we have to get to that granular detail to see where people are being left behind. So I think it's a good discussion and we need to be alert to it. But as you say, Jerome, the reference group should be the vehicle through which these problems are identified and then a strategy developed to respond to it.
Thanks very much, Julian. I'm going to give each of you like 30 seconds to a minute to give us some last thoughts because we're coming up on time, and then we'll do a bit of a summary and I'll give pass to Julian for closing remarks. So Chris, I'm going to go to you, then Hafsar, then Naya, if that works in that order.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Manisha. And just to pick up on the points about sort of involving, in our case, stateless people and stateless-led organisations, that's something we're increasingly trying to do. Half of our advisory committee is comprised now of stateless people or community-led organisations. But I think the other thing to mention here is the importance of capacity building. So, for example, we've done co-designed some training with the stateless people and the community organisations within our network to, has training on things like advocacy and other aspects. But on the funding point, I think it's also about thinking how we can collectively support these organisations to become registered so they can receive funding, because that is undoubtedly a barrier at the moment. On your question, Manisha, about sort of pledges at national level, I think there probably are ways we can improve that sort of strategic consultation between UNHCR and NGOs. But also, again, the fiscal aspect is relevant here too. If there's momentum in a country and a pledge, often to ensure implementation of that pledge, it needs pressure from two angles, not only UNHCR, but also from civil society. And obviously UNHCR does have partnership agreements with implemented partners at country level. And I think if these could be better aligned with pledges and areas where scope for reform is possible, that would make a lot of sense. And we've seen it work really well in Europe on, for example, Albania, which pledged the last GRF. And then there was a sort of tripartite approach between ENS, our member organisation in the country, and UNHCR, and we've seen them reform the nationality law, and they're about to introduce an SDP. So it can work.
An SDP?
Stateless determination procedure, sorry.
Thanks very much, Chris. Hafsar, final words from you in terms of leading up to the GRF and your role in the NGO for reference group, and the advisory board?
Well, one of the things that I would like to mention is, as APRIN, we are open to, in terms of NGO reference group and accessibility to this group, we are open to our member or non-member organization or individuals to reach out to us. And we have been lately really focusing on the identifying the barriers of RLOs and RLIs to the accessibility of resources and funding to continue their initiative or for the sustainability of their initiatives and the work, the very important work that they do on the ground. And also we have been recently trying to do capacity building and skill enhancements for the refugee RLOs in Malaysia in partnership with EPNOR. So my final comment would be, if there are any RLOs in Asia Pacific region or RLIs in Asia Pacific region who would like to reach out to us, we are always welcoming and opening to RLOs and RLIs, whether you are the member organization of APRIN or not. Leading up to GRF, as if I am wearing the head of permanent advisory group of UNHCR, it's about, again, if I may re-emphasize, it's about inclusion and representation of people from diverse refugee background. If we don't have the means to bring them in person, we have to explore the means to include them in other alternative possible way. And we have to find a way of their voices to be heard and bring on the table of discussion and consultation and make a decision. I'll end it here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hafsar. RLO is a refugee-led organization. RLI, I don't know that one.
Initiative.
It's refugee-led initiative. It's refugee-led initiatives.
Thank you. I feel like we need an acronym handbook going through the GRF. Naya, if I can turn to you, and then Jillian, I'm going to come to you for some closing remarks, then I'll do a quick summary at the end.
Sure. I just have one main point to close with, which is to focus on the sustainability of refugee-led organizations, because most of them rely on funding that are based on short-term goals, but they have long-term needs. So if we could find a way to cater for their long-term needs with not relying on funds just for short-term goals, that would be something very important going forward with GRF.
Super. Thanks very much, Naya. And somebody, Edmund Page Cohere, pointed out that the main localization session tomorrow during the NGO consultations will touch on some of these issues on practically reaching RLOs, and maybe that conversation can really look at that. Mm-hmm. How do we support them to be more sustainable and to kind of get past some of these barriers? And I think it's not just for refugee-led organizations, but also lots of just local organizations generally face many of these barriers in terms of funding. Jillian, if I can turn to you for some closing remarks, then I'll do a bit of a summary and a few notes about the NGO consultations, if I may.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I really only very briefly want to say how encouraging I find these meetings like this one. It's, as you say, with the technology, we can reach a much wider audience than we've ever been able to reach before. And so we will continue, of course, to use that technology. It becomes genuinely more inclusive, and we get more perceptions and ideas and initiatives that way. So I'm really encouraged by that. I would thank the NGO community. It's been outstanding. I think that you really are one of the great successes of the Compact, and we want to keep building on that for next year. Please do encourage your members to go through the process of reporting how the progress is going. We'll help you with it. If you're having difficulty technologically or otherwise, let us know, and we'll help. But also to think about where you want to go with the next set of pledges, because this is the opportunity now. We've come a long way, but we've still got a way to go before we get to the end of next year. But you will be a very important part of the forum. And we want to make sure that we meet that objective of leaving no one behind, but listening to the voices of people with experience to be inclusive as possible. I think we've got the message. We know that's critical, and it's a vital part of what we do. And I know the High Commissioner stands behind that. So thank you all. And I will be speaking at the meeting tomorrow on localization. And many of the ideas that we've been discussing now will be picked up again for that meeting. But I think that the great opportunity and the purpose of this meeting was to talk about the refugee reference group. I think this is the great group that can reach out, get the issues out, and encourage more people to come in with ideas and be as welcoming to everybody through our various groups and your various NGO groups, so that we can make sure that we can hear the voices of all those, particularly those with experience. So thank you all, and back to you.
Thanks very much, Gillian, and huge thanks to the panel. I think Chris, Hafsar, Naya, and Gillian, you've all provided great insights in terms of how things have worked since the GRF in 2019 and where we're going to be going in the lead up to the 2023 Global Refugee Forum. And I think really that point that it's about putting the Global Compact into practice, really building on the lessons from the 2019 Global Refugee Forum to make sure that we've got really strong joint pledges going into 2023, really using this NGO reference group as that entry point, but as NGOs, making sure that we're also holding the feet of the networks, your feet to the fire, just like HCR is going to be holding, we should be holding HCR's feet to the fire.
Yes.
And if there are any challenges with the way the reference group is working, to really flag that early on, but use that as an opportunity to really be inclusive, as many of you have said, really ensuring that we find creative ways to identify the voices of refugees that may not be so easily heard. And I think particularly at the country level, finding ways for NGOs and UNHCR to work together to really identify those refugee voices, but then working collectively together to see what kind of pledges can be there in terms of those collective outcomes, working with governments, working with other actors in the whole of society, and that whole of society approach will be critical. And I think, just as you pointed out, Gillian, at the beginning, I like that whole of universe approach. It's really, how do we bring everybody together to make sure we're implementing the Global Compact on refugees, but also what's in the Fundamental Refugee Convention as well, particularly at a time when states are really pushing back on many of the fundamental tenets of refugee law and what we should be doing much more. And I think using the opportunity of the openness to Ukrainian refugees, we need to build on that momentum and really make that much more universal in terms of the approach to refugees. And I think really finding ways, as many of you have highlighted, of really supporting refugee-led organizations or initiatives, so that we are not just sitting in a room in Geneva, but really identifying ways to bring their voices, particularly through hybrid events like this. And I think COVID has really shown how much we are able to do using the technology that's out there. So really, how do we bring those voices in through the preparation for the GRF, but also at the GRF itself? And I think working on that advocacy jointly, where we may have states that are providing blockages, how do we as NGOs and UNHCR work together, I think will be critical to make sure that those voices are really brought forward. So thank you all for a really great panel, for kicking off the NGO reference group and launching that officially. And all of you for participating. Huge thanks also to those in the room who've been providing technical support, Leah and Nora. Also to PHAP in the background for doing all the online stuff, and our interpreters and our captioner, and everyone who has participated today. Thank you all for your engaging questions and comments in the chat. And we look forward to you joining the NGO consultations, which are officially starting today. And everyone is welcome to join and participate in those, either online or in person. So we look forward to that, and really look forward to everybody engaging in the lead up to the GRF, because I think it's working collectively together that we're really going to be able to make the next GRF a real success, based on the work that we do to put in there, in the preparation work to get there. And I think really bringing everyone together will be critical. The recording of this event will be online on UNHCR's website, and really hope that it's laid the foundation for a kickoff to really planning and moving ahead on the GRF. So huge thanks to everyone again. I wish you a good day.